Joe, I know you're well-versed in the Catholic tradition, how Scripture and tradition interplay within that context. Here in the Episcopal Church, we honor a similar appreciation for Scripture and tradition, but we also highlight reason as a critical third component. Together, they form what we call the three-legged stool: Scripture, tradition, and reason. Joe, you may have heard of this concept before, and let us develop this in depth. How does it differ from the Catholic approach? Think of each element as a leg of a stool. If one leg is missing or too dominant, the stool wobbles. The Episcopal Church believes that keeping all three in balance is vital to a faithful and flexible understanding of God's truth. Scripture is our foundation. The Episcopal Church holds the Old and New Testaments as inspired texts, guiding our doctrine, worship, and moral teachings. But we encourage contextual reading, not rigid literalism. In Catholicism, you may have a magisterium that interprets it. How does the Episcopal Church handle interpretation without that centralized authority? In Episcopal context, we interpret Scripture through communal study, prayer, and respect for scholarly work, always mindful of historical context. Our liturgical worship is steeped in biblical readings, ensuring the Bible remains front and center in our spiritual life. Yet each believer is also encouraged to engage the text with an open heart and mind. In Episcopal Church, tradition, the living heritage of the Church. It's not just about the past, it's the wisdom we've inherited from the early Church, the Church Fathers, and centuries of liturgical and theological development. The Episcopal Church draws from the wellspring of Christian history, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Reformation influences, without insisting on a single, inflexible system of doctrine. We retain the creeds and apostolic teachings as vital anchors, but we interpret them in conversation with Scripture and our evolving understanding of God's will. The third leg is reason, the gift of intellect, discernment, and personal conscience. Episcopalians believe God calls us to use our minds critically and creatively. It's not about discarding tradition or contradicting Scripture. It's about engaging them thoughtfully. In your Catholic background, Joe, reason may have a role as well, but often you rely on magisterial teachings for clarity, not the individual reason. How does this differ in an Episcopal setting? Here we see reason as a path to continual growth. It invites dialogue with science, philosophy, and cultural insights. It means we can wrestle openly with tough ethical questions about social issues, medical advances, or interfaith relations, while rooted in scriptural and traditional perspectives. Our theology breathes and adapts, yet remains authentically Christian. Joe, as you move from Catholic priesthood to the Episcopal priesthood, remember this balance. Scripture is our spiritual compass. Tradition connects us to the Church's historic faith. Reason helps us apply these truths in a modern world. Each leg supports and informs the others. You need to appreciate this balance. It feels like this emphasis gives room for personal discernment, yet stays anchored in the core of the faith. In your upcoming ministry, Joe, preach with depth. When you interpret Scripture and sermons, draw on the breadth of Christian tradition and the clarity of reason. Speak in ways that illuminate the biblical text for today's context. Shape worship and pastoral care. Use liturgical tradition as a springboard, innovating thoughtfully and pastorally. Encourage your congregation to think deeply about their faith, inviting their reason and experiences into the conversation. Engage ethical and social issues. Show how the Church, through Scripture, tradition, and reason, can address modern challenges like racial justice, climate change, or emerging bioethical questions. Offer a balanced perspective rooted in God's love and wisdom. Joe, you need to see how this three-legged stool can guide your decisions, sermons, and pastoral practices. It's a new lens. It must resonate with your experiences and desire to serve faithfully. Joe, this triad, Scripture, tradition, and reason, will be your faithful companion as you transition into Episcopal ministry. It's not a rigid formula, but a dynamic interplay that enriches your walk with God. Embrace it fully and let it shape your preaching, teaching, and pastoral care. I'm excited, Joe, in your journey to grow in this tradition, honoring Scripture, cherishing tradition, and using reason as God's gift to guide the Church into the future. Good luck, Joe.